Hello and welcome to the Advanced Design Center at the Barber Museum. And today we're going to go 50 years back in time to Wolverhampton, England, to the Norton factory. And we have the pleasure of one of the Norton designers from the original day with us here, and of course our resident Norton expert and technical advisor to the museum, Mr. Slark. So Mick Ofield, let's go back 50 years to Wolverhampton, England, as a young man designing and sketching Nortons. And tell us how design basically was 50 years ago.
Well, I started at Norton's in 1972. I came pretty much straight from art college, so I was just 23 years old, pretty young. By that time I was already a Norton fanatic, so it was like a dream job to me. And as a pre-interview with my future boss, Bob Trigg, he asked me to go back home and design some handlebar controls for a bike. And I guess that was my make or break as his point of view. So I went back home, sketched out some handlebar controls, went back to the factory, and this was all by train because I didn't have any vehicle, and went back to the factory and showed him the designs, and he goes, yeah, well, I think we can use you. So from that point on, I started my dream job there.
So just to kind of go a bit back and forward, so you're employed by Norton. How does it feel now, 50 years later? You know, to design something 50 years ago, you took out your pen, your paper. Obviously, we're in the Advanced Design Center now, where this is here to show people how things are done by computer. It's such a different world.
It's a very different world. You look back then, and from the viewpoint we have today, it all looks really primitive. You know, what there wasn't there just looks primitive, but at the time, that was the way we did it. You know, I had an office at the end of the drawing office, and I was looked upon with a bit of suspicion because I was a young guy from an art college, and people were a bit leery about that. But because I rode a motorcycle and I had a lot of mechanical knowledge, finally I got more and more accepted, because the guys in the drafting department, you know, they were pretty conservative guys, and they would be drawing out engineering type drawings, and I'd be sketching what the things meant to look like. So it was two different worlds. But once we started to communicate with each other, it was good. One of the problems was that in those days there was no computer aided design, there was no computer aided modeling. So if I sketched something out and gave it to a draftsman, it was tough for him to know how to draw it so somebody could make it. So the solution to that was produce something in 3 dimensions that he could then get his French curves on and transfer those to the paper and find a way of getting it to be manufactured. That was the biggest step, was something amorphous like a gas tank with some subtle shapes to it, trying to get that to a manufacturer so he can make it with the same subtle shapes. Because without any computer modeling, it all had to be done via radiuses drawn on a drawing. And I think that was the biggest hurdle for me as a product designer, was getting that across so that when a manufacturer made it, it came out either like the mock-up I made or like the sketch I did.
So you were actually a product designer for Norton from 1972 through to 1980. So your tenure, the Commander was already in existence. You worked through what would have been the last Norton through the rotary up until 1980. But Brian obviously had been with Norton. You started in 1960.
I started at Associated Motorcycles, which was AJS Matches and Norton. Francis Barnett and James in 57.
Right.
And working in a factory that was built and designed in the maybe 20s. So it was pretty agricultural.
Right.
About 3 steps up from a blacksmith shop.
But you guys never actually met back
No.
in the days.
Well, I'm sure I passed across, but we worked for the same people. I answered to the chief. Bob was chief designer. I worked with the chief designer. I worked with the service department, production. I was like the North American voice.
But
So,
you had been in England up until
I was up in it. Yeah, I left England in '64, but I went to BSA factory facility in California, and then I was lured back to Norton in 1969.
Okay, so you were in America a little while before Mick came.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so you knew of each other, but
We
you
knew of
never
each other.
actually.
Yeah.
So
I
you were
think the
working
first time
together
I met-
for.
Well, we knew, we sat down last night and we knew so many people, mutual friends, that Mick knew and I knew.
Yeah.
So it was all in a group, you know.
Yeah. Well, we're really excited to have you guys here today, and obviously we have the backdrop of the bikes that you designed, built, tuned, raced.
Designed them, I had to keep them running.
But you both raced them as well, right? So, I mean, it wasn't just you went to the job, made some designs and went home. I mean, your whole lives were around these motorcycles.
I think both of us could say motorcycling was in our blood
Yeah.
because it was our life really. It still is, a lesser extent, but it still is. One of the interesting things that when I joined Norton was all the people that worked in the development department and design department, most of them anyway, were also motorcycle enthusiasts. It wasn't just a job for them. They didn't just turn up and get paid and it was a job. And we socialized a lot together as well, which was unusual in those days for people that you work with 8 hours a day and then want to see them at weekends as well. It was quite a tight-knit community. Like a lot of motorcycle communities, there's something about motorcycles that draws people together as a community.
I think the end product, I mean, when you look at the motorcycles, you're not building like a metal shed or something, you know, I mean, it's a beautiful product, and I think I never worked so hard in my life, but it's been so rewarding.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you've got this great product. At 50, it's hard to believe that 50 years later we'll be sitting here talking about it, because we only thought the next day or next week. We weren't that far ahead, you know, you just took care of what you were doing.
And I think it was a very interesting perspective that you said. You know, it's so easy to look back at this primitive, archaic design. I mean, these things you guys were working on the cutting edge of technology in your era.
We just didn't realize it at the time. It was just a way of doing things to get things done. And, you know, like when we got involved with doing some work on brand new engines, and our casting facility was busy making production items, so they didn't really have much time to make special patterns. So we finished up making a crankcase out of polystyrene and then using that as like a lost wax process, which is what jewelers do. Jewelers make rings. If it's a special design of ring, they'll make it out of wax, then they'll cast plaster around it, then pour molten silver in, the wax disappears, and they break the plaster away, and there's the beautiful ring. Well, we used a similar process, but we used polystyrene like ceiling tiles, but you could buy blocks of it, cut it into the shape we wanted with a hot wire, made a crankcase. This was for the prototype Cosworth engine we were testing. Made a crankcase, gave it to the foundry department, they packed sand around it, and then they poured molten aluminum into it and broke the sand away when it had cooled down, and there is your crankcase, complete with the funny little textures that polystyrene has, you know. But amazingly, it was not porous at all, because when you pour something like molten aluminum onto polystyrene, it might disappear all of a sudden, but if you slowed it down, it holds it back, and it doesn't just get all porous like an aero bar. So it was again, that at the time was really, wow, that's an interesting way of doing it. But today, you think, how primitive is that? You know.
I just want to maybe offer a translation. You said that it doesn't get porous like an aero bar. Are you referring to the candy we used to eat when we were kids?
Yeah.
So if anyone wants to know what an aero bar is, it's like a chocolate-covered candy, but there's lots of little holes in it. So I'm just translating the English vernacular here for you.
And it was a problem with aluminum castings. We had porous cylinder heads, porous crankcases, and you know, the whole casting process, it looks simple, but it's pretty complex to get it right.
What we did at the time, the Commander was one of the first superbikes. And when I was in Los Angeles, I used to get calls from the guys from Honda and Yamaha, Kawasaki, Suzuki, can we borrow a Commander for the weekend? And I thought that was a huge compliment, that there we are, like 1% of the market, and we had the big four. The guys just loved to take a Commander for the weekend, and they come back and say, boy, it's a great motorcycle. And sort of David and Goliath type of situation.
What did you guys feel in England at the factory about the ones that were working out in the colonies? How were they regarded in those days?
A pain in the neck.
I mean, they're in the
sometimes.
sunshine, you know, they're drinking mixed drinks. You're in the freezing cold British winter, and they're out in California running around the desert.
Well, that was a problem. They never wanted me to go to England. They always wanted to visit me in California. You know, especially in the winter, we would get a lot of guys had to come over and just see what we were doing. You know.
Well, really, you guys were part 3 of a triangle. We had the manufacturing in Wolverhampton, which is in the Midlands. It's a huge industrial area called the Black Country mainly because there was so much industry there. The buildings turned black over time. Then in the south was Andover Norton, which was sales and assembly and service, and then in the US was Norton USA. So it was a triangle. And from Wolverhampton, we rarely even went to Andover, let alone the United States.
Norton Village Corporation, when we opened that up in January 1969 in Los Angeles, it was the first satellite that the factory had ever done. And like factory owned, because Berlin around the East Coast had the United States. So we opened up Norton Village Corporation with 4 people, and it was very successful. So after that, the chairman, Dennis Poor, we had Norton Village Canada, Norton Village France, Australia, and we set the nucleus of having all these factory-owned facilities around the world, basically, for distribution and service. So we were kind of groundbreaking, but we didn't know it at the time. We were so busy we didn't have time to think about it.
Down, but not from side to side. So you had a pretty well-handling motorcycle that didn't vibrate your teeth out when you rode it.
Well, it was still vibrating away, but you didn't feel it because you were isolated from it, basically.
And that was what gave you the problem with the combat engine.
You couldn't feel the vibration.
So what was their answer to? So were these engines exploding, or?
Yeah.
And that's why you had to get towed in with the rope.
I just repaired one yesterday for one of the guys.
They had a semi-racing camshaft in them to give extra performance, and it was just, you know, the engine itself, like Brian was saying, had a long ancestry behind it. So we had all kinds of odd things occurring with it, which we'd seen racing, but now they're occurring on the street as well. Like the cylinder barrels had a flange around the bottom, and the cylinder barrels were held on to the crankcase with studs and nuts. So they broke just above the flange. So with the 850 engine, bolts came all the way through the cylinders, from the top of the cylinder to the crankcase to cure the problem. And it was one of those things which you look back and you think, yeah, if you isolate the vibration from the rider, there's no warning that he's really pushing it all the time, because we're used to bikes now that you can redline all the time and there's no problem. But back in those days, if you redlined it all the time, eventually
they were really hard.
Yeah. Eventually your internal components become external components, and it's just a problem.
So these were all challenges you were facing constantly.
Basically, the engine was built for a 25 horsepower 500, and it kept getting more power, so you keep breaking things and upgrading.
But wasn't this the problem that Triumph were having, because they were doing the same thing?
Yeah, I think everybody with an old design, but the difference is in the United States, the motorcycles we were selling, guys would go, it was all quarter-mile time. So it was stoplight to stoplight. But you take in Europe, say Autobahn, the guy would hold the thing wide open
for mile after mile,
and they didn't like it. you know, and main bearings would disintegrate and
So these were
run
problems.
them out of oil and
Yeah.
different uses of the motorcycle. Basically.
So really, the 850, not the Mark III, but the Mark II and the Mark IIA, was a much better bike for the consumer. A lot of the materials were better, the crankcases were stronger, the cylinder barrels had through bolts, and it was just a better all-round bike, and very popular. Made in two forms. There was the Roadster with a fairly short gas tank, and the Interstate with a longer gas tank, larger capacity. And then as time went by and legislation came in forcing everybody to use a left-hand shifter rather than a right-hand shifter, redesign had to take place, and that's when the Mark III was designed. And at the time it's like, well, okay, we also need to put an electric start on this thing, because you know the average person by that time wasn't used to kick-starting, and an 850 was hard to kick. It was hard to kick over, you know. And the first electric starts we had, they were like kick assist. If you push the button and kicked at the same time.
I've got a fabulous article by Peter Egan that he did with you about that, really not being very favourable about early Norton electric starts.
They were kick assists,
yeah.
and they made the noise. They made a funny squawking noise. It was like a bird coming down to consume something. It's like, uh-oh.
Well, you know, the Commander, when it first came out, the S model with the high pipe in America in 1970, the Street Scrambler was a hot setup. So they sold at hotcakes. They were very light, very fast and fragile, and as the years get on they got more reliable, heavier and slower. It's just the evolution. It lost its lightness, and the Mark III was a lot structurally stronger and more reliable in many ways.
But it was probably heavier.
But it was heavier and slower.
Quite a bit heavier, yeah.
Yeah.
So if you were to pick, you know, obviously we've got some of the bikes that you guys designed and worked on, which is, you know, and rode and raced, and this is such an honor to have you guys here talking about this today. But if you had to pick one, what is your favorite?
I would say a Roadster Mark II. If I didn't have my old legs that I have now, Roadster Mark II. It was more fun to ride. The riding position was more canted forwards. The Interstate was, because the gas tank was so long, your feet were farther forwards and you leant forwards, so you were like a C riding it. And at speed, it was very tiring. Whereas the Roadster with the smaller gas tank, your footrests were underneath your butt. It was more like rear sets.
It was a nice riding position.
Ergonomically, it was way nicer, yeah.
Brian, what is your?
The most comfortable was a fastback for me.
Yeah.
It just fitted me. But I think the most exciting one, the one that we had most success with, was the S model with the high pipes, flashy, noisy. I have to tell you, Bob Trigg, the designer, and the chairman Dennis Ball would come to the United States often, and we would go to Houston to the Astrodome when they had the indoor dirt track races and the big motorcycle show, and we would walk around the car park and look at the bikes, and we would look at bikes with high handlebars and different seats and different paint. And when Bob looked at this, and that evolved into the High Rider, which is not very popular in the Norton circles, but at the time, if I'm right, it was the first production, I won't say custom motorcycle, but more, you know, with the high bars.
Chopper style.
A chopper style. It was the first one without extended forks. But that was, you know, they always say that innovation is a dangerous thing, and there was another thing. When I was at Norton, Cycle World would always have a big show in Los Angeles, and all the guys I used to work for BSA, and there was guys at Triumph and Honda and everything, and I walked in with the John Player Special, the racer, and they looked at it and said, that is the goofiest looking motorcycle. It looks like a frog. Who would ever make a motorcycle with 2 headlights? And they absolutely ridiculed it.
And you think
and
about
now
today.
you look today, and it's common, but to be an innovator is really sticking your neck out. It's a dangerous thing. It really is.
I know that we want to talk to you about a lot of designs, but there's got to be a question that so many people will ask you about the Norton girls and the inside cover. This is, I mean, this is quite a part of the.
Yeah,
you guys were. I mean, you had to drag the bikes for the shoots, and there's so much involved in that that no one saw.
The whole Norton advertising campaign was already running when I joined Norton, and part of the job of product designer and stylist was to be at the photo shoots. And so I went there with a friend who was a designer called Richard Negus, and we didn't realize that the studio was on the 2nd floor. And so we had these heavy bikes that we couldn't scratch because they show in the photographs, and we had to lift them up a whole series of stairs, then a landing, and turn them around to go up the next series of stairs, and then into a studio. And the studio was really small. By today's standard, it was small. And then we had to get the bikes set up so they looked right in the camera. And that meant compressing the rear suspension. There's a lot of work to make them. They look like, as you know, when you look at something in a camera, it's not the same as when you look at it with your eye. It's totally different. So we had to get it looking right in the camera. Then the model would arrive, and everybody got all flustered about that, and she'd sit on the bike, and there'd be endless this and that and the other, and finally the photo shoot would be over. By that time we'd missed lunch, and it was like mid-afternoon, and we were like, just get the bike out of here, where all the hobnobs would go off and have dinner or lunch or somewhere. So we then drive all the way back to Wolverhampton. It was a long, long day, really long day.
Well, I mean, you said they wouldn't even buy you a hotel room. I mean, there was none of that in those days, right?
No, I mean, we were like, just to get the bikes there, and while you're doing the photo shoot was also for all the different models. So you'd be changing gas tanks and seats and handlebars, and it was quite an effort. But the final result was a brilliant advertising campaign. The photos looked really good. The bikes looked great in the photos.
The girls were fantastic.
Yeah.
And also, Dennis Porter, chairman, was very smart. He went to Cycle and Cycle World, the 2 biggest magazines in North America, and we had the inside front cover every month. And those things become collector items, and we found out later that when the magazines went to Vietnam, these guys would tear off the front cover and stick it up on the bunk, and when they returned to the United States, first thing they did is buy a Commander and ride it home. It's kind of an interesting era, really.
Yeah, successful campaign, and the brochures. The photo shoots were also for the brochures as well. And many times we would, like when the 850 first came out, it was a complete shell engine. There was nothing in there at all because we didn't have everything ready. And one of the first brochures, where the engine numbers stamped on the crankcase, there was nothing there. And we didn't notice it until the brochure proofs came through. It's like, oh, there's no engine number, we better get something done. But in those days, to do something like that was a major to do. It wasn't like you could get into Photoshop and mess it up, So
when they did the brochure, they would send copies to me, and I had to Americanize it. Instead of like primary chain, I was triple row heavy duty, and I had to glamorize the script so it read to an American and not in English. So,
and the spelling was different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you had to do in
tire, gasoline, petrol.
Yeah, it's kind of different.
But it must have been an interesting time also in marketing and that, because it was when the motorcycle, media world was sort of changing from almost like a manual to a lifestyle. Yes. And you guys were sort of the early part of that transition between just getting a black and white brochure, you know, with spec sheets to it now becoming something.
It had to look attractive and yeah.
And colours. I mean, you suddenly started working with colours.
Well, you know, Norton was always black or silver, and the first Commanders, they had red and green, and then I think 1971 we had 7 metal flake colours: metal flake purple, metal flake bronze, and a lot of the dealers were more mom and pop operations or old racers, and they said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever seen, you know. Well, after they sold the 7th purple one, it's pretty good, but the problem is, in those early days, they put it in the showroom window and it would fade. And they said, what do we do? And I said, turn it round. You know, so they would turn it round, so it's the same each side, yeah, yeah. And then the early ones, the frames would break, because Stefan Bauer designed the frame, and he didn't.
These are the Commandos?
Yeah.
Yes, he
750
didn't.
or 850?
Early 750, like 1968, and you bounce along, and the front end would rake out, you know, till the engine hit the ground. So they had to have a big recall, and they stiffened the frame. They put a frame tube under the steering head, so the steering head didn't tuck under. Yeah, that was another interesting scenario. And I have to tell you this: the scientific way of testing was to take the motorcycles to an old railroad track, and the guys would ride down the railroad over the sleepers until the frame destroyed, and it was so tiring they could only do like 10 minutes, and they'd swap over, get some water, and that was their scientific frame stress test.
Before we get started on your history with Norton and Wolverhampton Design, I'd just like to take a moment to ask your feelings on being here at the Advanced Design Center now, 50 years on, where we've got some of the world's most forward-leading projects in design, and you've got your bikes and your designs. What sort of feeling did you get this morning walking in?
I think modern technology to me is just awesome, you know. And one of the problems as a designer, you have an idea in your head, and it's tough to get that idea from your head to the final product, and that's always been a challenge. But with today's technology, it is a wee bit easier than it used to be, because you could come up with a either a three-dimensional object that you could then model and produce a drawing from, or you could do it virtually in computer-aided design. Whereas before, it was a question of sketching something out, using felt pens to color it to see what it's like with color, and then trying to get that concept to either the manufacturer or the guy on the drawing board who does the drawing for the manufacturer. And it was all very two-dimensional. The only three-dimensional part was if you actually produced a mock-up, a three-dimensional mock-up, and then you had to carefully package that and ship it to whoever was going to make the final part, and they would do their best to replicate what you'd sent to them, but there was no exact science to it. You know, the gas tanks, if you measured a gas tank that was produced pre-computer aided design, you'd probably find the curves are slightly different either side, because it was all done by eye and by French curves, which is a whole series of plastic shapes that you use to do your drawings and you use to check out your final job. So today, with the modern technology, I think it's fantastic. You know, I think it's great what you can do, and you'll notice that especially engines, today's engines are very compact, because you can computerize what's happening inside the engine when you design it, and you can get down to tiny clearances between moving parts. In the old days, it was all, you had to draw it all out, and most draftsmen didn't necessarily have a conceptual three-dimensional mind, because they were working in 2 dimensions. So a lot of the older engines, when you look at them, have acres of space inside them, because you couldn't conceptualize how everything would fit together. Now it can all be done via computer, and one of the byproducts of that is you'll notice how tiny engines are compared to how big they used to be. So yeah, it's a technology which I think is amazing. I mean, it blows my mind because I don't actually do computer-aided design, but I see the result of it, and I see, you know, the results around this studio, and computer-aided modeling and 3D printing. It's, you know, we get all excited if we could print a color printer out of an old-fashioned color printer, let alone three-dimensional printing. So yeah, I'm in awe of it.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously really, you know, very honored to have you here, and you know, the fact that we can sit here, speak to you, look at your designs and drawings, and then thanks to the work of Mr. Slark here over the last 27 years, with this incredible collection, we just literally pop downstairs, bring the bike up that you designed, put it behind us for a set.
Yeah,
I mean, there's nowhere else in the world that we could make these things happen, and that's very exciting.
It is exciting, and because there are so many different bikes here at the museum from different eras, you can follow the logical engineering progress. Yeah. From way back when a bicycle was literally a cycle with an engine bolted into it, and that was a motorbike, you know, a bicycle with a motor. And then you can follow
going
it through.
forward, obviously, we're going to be really excited to share the process with Pierre, who designed the mono project here at the Advanced Design Center with Brian, to show how it's done. You know, you're showing us how it was done 50 years ago. We're going to be able to later show how it's done today.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a giant leap. You know,
I think when you look at the Commando, I think it's purity of line. I mean, if you look at it 50 feet away, 100 feet away, you know it's a Commando. Or you look at a Triumph, and you can see that it was drawn with a pencil. It flows. A lot of modern bikes are wrapped in plastic, and I personally, I can't tell one from the other. But if you look at the bikes from the 60s or 70s, there's that stark purity about them. You look at a T160 Triumph, you know what it is. You don't have to look at the gas tank name. They've just got their own.
It had a visual that told you what it was.
They have a really visual individuality to them that is timeless, really.
But I wonder if we had young designers with us, that they feel the same way about a Ducati or a Triumph.
That's a good question. I mean, the motorcycle industry, to me, seems to be on the move again in different directions. With the era of selling tens of thousands of motorcycles seems to be over. We seem to be going to the point where we're selling specialist motorcycles to people who want whatever mentally they feel they want. So you're seeing perhaps a revert back to individual looking motorcycles that we used to see. The only difference is that we don't have this huge flock of young people wanting to go motorcycling. We have a whole era now of young people who get a lot of enjoyment out of two-dimensional video games, and the idea of actually getting dirty and going on a motorcycle doesn't necessarily appeal to them. So we're into a whole new era of challenge to try and put the excitement back into riding a motorcycle. It's very exciting riding a motorcycle. It's a very free feeling, and you know, a lot of times if you can get somebody on one, then they go, wow, I didn't know it was like this. But that's the challenge for the manufacturers and the dealers, is to get young kids back on motorcycles. We're not dealing with servicemen coming back from the Vietnam War with money to burn, wanting some thrills. We're not dealing with that any longer. We're in a whole different era, and that's what's great about some of the events we have here at Barber, is we have manufacturers turn up giving demo rides to people, so they've got a chance to actually ride around and see what it's like to ride a motorcycle. I mean, some people are coming back to motorcycling after they've raised a family and they've got a bit of money to burn. Some people never gave it up, like Brian and I, and hopefully we have enough young people to keep the industry alive. But it is going to be a challenge.
And I think you make a good point, especially here because we have everything from Vintage Festival to superbike racing. So there's something for, or just museum visiting. So there's something for everybody in the motorcycle space here.
Don't forget that Barber introduced a small bore event for motorcycles under 250, and
so
it's most encouraging to see so many young people enjoying themselves on little motorcycles, young affluent people. Honda regarded it as important. They introduced the Grom, the new Grom here, and talking to a friend that just retired from Honda, they missed a generation. They were so busy building super bikes, they forgot about the little entry-level bikes. But now there's a lot of entry-level motorcycles.
Starting
bikes.
hopefully the
They're
feeder
not
cycle back.
Intimidating, and hopefully that's a new generation.
So maybe you're able to come out of retirement, Mick, and design us up some new
Come
some
over
new
for
bikes.
small bore and see the people enjoying themselves on those little bikes. It's amazing, and they spend a lot of money on them. They customize them and hard them up, and
Well, that's the other side of it as well. Is
that's
you know,
encouraging.
companies like Royal Enfield are making what we would probably call basic bikes, but they're basic bikes that are affordable, and they have a whole range of customizing stuff. So once you buy it, when you have a bit more money to spare, you can change it so that it's your bike rather than, you know, just a bike. It's your bike.
And recognizable.
As motorcyclists age, you know, they're looking for something smaller, lighter, lower.
Yeah.
Less intimidating, less heavy, you know, lighter, just you know, evolution.
I think it's reassuring that the manufacturers, because of what a challenging market we're dealing with now, are going back to basics, going back to producing bikes that are just fun to ride. They don't have all the sophistication that a road race bike has, but there's a limited number of people who want to buy that type of bike with all the sophistication. But there's a lot of people who just want to have fun on a motorcycle. And I go back to when I first bought a motorcycle in England at the time. When you were 16, you could get a motorcycle license. When you were 17, you could get a car license. And I said to my parents, when I was 16, I want a motorcycle. And my dad says, no, you just want a motorcycle because it's the first motorized transport you can have at your age. Wait till you're 17 and make a decision. So come to be 17, I want a motorcycle. So I bought what at the time was an entry level, which is a 200cc Triumph Tiger Cub. And to me, it was like a massive bike. I mean, today we'd look at it as a pit bike almost.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
But in those days, wow, it was a massive bike. But it was so enjoyable because prior to that, as a young person to get around, it was ride your bicycle.
It was freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. It was
You
freedom.
know, every kid had a bicycle. When you got a motorcycle, you could go further, faster.
Yeah.
But you know, you started on these small motorcycles as young teenagers, and look at it, it evolved into a lifetime of design and industry. And
you know, you had to learn how to repair it yourself. You couldn't afford to take it at a dealer.
That's right.
And you always knew someone that knew someone how to fix it, or would show you with rudimentary tools, no garage. Just you did it because you had the enthusiasm and you wanted to do it.
I can tell you how heavy a Honda 125 engine is, because when I took it out and carried it up to the shop to get the new piston put in, I had to stop about half a dozen times. You don't go far, even a small engine like that was heavy.
Right. And back then, maintenance was essential because the engineering wasn't there to have a maintenance-free motorcycle. You know, you had to be good at maintenance. It's not like with today's engines. To me, they're almost like bulletproof. They're amazing. I mean, you look at, say, today's cars, how often do you check the oil? You don't have to check the oil because it don't burn any oil. Back in those days, you'd be checking the oil every major trip you took.
But on the other hand, if you had a motorcycle as a kid, the engine never got cold because you lived on it. You used it every day. And when you use something every day, you know if something's going out of wrong, and you service it. You always went out with a toolkit, magneto wrenches, spark plug. You had to take everything. Your jacket weighed about 30 pounds with all the stuff that you said, but if it stopped at the side of the road, you know, you just had to fix it or you pushed it.
And if you were going on a long journey, like when I was 18, I toured around Europe on a 500cc Norton. You taped a spare clutch cable alongside your clutch cable and a spare brake cable alongside your brake cable. So when it broke, because they broke, you had another one right there and then to do. And you know, again, the technology wasn't there to make things that didn't break. You know, we're looking at these days, most machines have hydraulic controls, but even if they don't, with cable controls, they have what we call a braided cable, which is nice and flexible. Back when we started riding, the internal cable was like stiffer than a board. I mean, it's just,
and they were
they broke.
Okay, you got to learn to ride without a clutch.
So you could save the cable.
No, if
Or
it broke, you had to get home.
Yeah. But so one of the problems that during the Norton Commando era was to get it through to the designers that the new person who's buying a Commando doesn't have this history of maintenance. They're just buying a bike and they're assuming it's going to be as reliable as their car. So they don't have years and years of maintaining a motorcycle. And it was a hard thing to get over that, look, we've got to make these things better because the person who's buying it, they're just going to ride it, period. And they're not going to necessarily check the oil every trip. They're not going to do this, they're not going to do that. So it was a challenge which we partly met with the Commando, especially the Mark III, but we never really completely met it. The Japanese met it perfect. You know, the Japanese got it right. I often think if you had a perfect world, you'd probably have a European person design something, Japanese company make it, and American sell it. Because sales in America is really strong. It always has been. Some engine go, the belt to the fan had broken. So the restriction on the RPMs wasn't there all of a sudden. Everybody running into the try and shut it down in time. But you know, you look at it now and you do engine testing with computer controlled designs, computer controlled throttles, pretty much everything. But back then everything was mechanical. You know, the draftsman would be drawing something with, you know, French curves and T-squares, and if something was wrong, it had to be all erased and start again. And so it was a long process doing the actual physical design work. And when I was really young at school, I wanted to be an engineer. I thought I had this mechanical mind that God had given me, and I thought, great, I'll be an engineer. But I wasn't good enough at math. I didn't realize math was involved with engineering. When I was a little kid, you know, it's like, oh, I just want to draw stuff and make it. And then you realize that all these calculations had to be done, and you know, the electric calculators had only just come around at the time, so there were people with these massive slide rules. And a slide rule is like an early version of a calculator, but it's a mechanical calculator. And the longer the rule, the more accurate it is, because you've got all these little increments. So there were these fantastic guys with their slide rules, and they're calculating all the forces and drawing these really complex engines. And there was me from art college going, well, that looks great, but it might work, but it looks horrible. That's a horrible looking engine you've drawn. So there was a bit of a conflict to start with, but then when we got on the same wavelength, it went as well as it could go with the technology we had. You know, it really was one of the most exciting times that I've had, and one of the best times as far as personalities. Everybody was very, very gifted in what they did. You'd have a guy, and all he did was concentrate on gearboxes. He knew what broke, he knew how to fix them, he knew how to tell the design department, if you do this, we'll have less breakages. And it was an interesting group of people like that, that came from when I first joined Norton's, BSA still had what they call Umberslade Hall, which was like a R&D place. And there was some real nerdish eggheads working there that were very brilliant at what they did, but had little practical experience. When Norton's combined and we had Norton Villiers Triumph, BSA was on board as well. So a lot of the guys from there joined us at Wolverhampton, and we had a very, very creative design and development department then, because we were able to take advantage of some of these more scientific approaches that Umberslade Hall had the money to do. And that was what helped the 850 come to fruition in a relatively short time, and also helped it be a bit more scientifically designed rather than a by gosh by golly approach. We actually did stress testing on swing arms, and while that was going on, I was doing a lot of like modeling work with modeling clay to see what shape we could make the gas tanks to make them more comfortable. Did a lot of work on the controls. Lucas made the controls, which was the, you know, the dimmer switch, the starter button, everything else. Lucas made those right from when Commandos first appeared. And Lucas was a massive company, and motorcycles were a tiny part of their business. So when we asked them to completely redesign the handlebar controls, to begin with, they said, no, you can just take what we make or forget it. Well, the Japanese and the Italian industry was starting to really mature then. So our answer to them was, fine, we'll buy Japanese handlebar controls from Yamaha under license, or we'll buy controls from Italy. And all of a sudden, the rationale changed. Well, okay, what do you want? So going back to when I first did my pre-interview and designed handlebar controls, now it was doing it for real. Now it was doing it for the real thing. And they appeared on the Mark III. And you know, they're more ergonomically correct than the first ones were, and they just looked a lot better. Because prior to that, you bought something from Lucas, and that same thing would appear on a BSA, a Norton, a Triumph. So it was hard to differentiate one make to another, because you were buying these parts that were made by an outside company, and then it gave you no choice. You have these handlebar controls or you don't. You have these gas taps or you don't. So the bikes didn't have their own personalities much like they do today.
So what year was that? What year was that?
Roughly. What year was it?
Yeah.
The Mark III was about, what, 73?
75.
Oh, later than that. No, 75 was
Late
towards the end,
74
wasn't
for
it?
75.
Perhaps
75
74.
it had to be left foot shift.
I mean, one of the interesting things when you're in the design, you're a year ahead. So to me it was 73, 74,
Yeah.
but the public didn't see him until 75. You know.
Actually, the 1975 Mark III, if you look at the parts list and numbers, it's like 90% new.
Yeah.
I mean, the castings look the same, but they're thicker. The gearbox shell is different. It looks the same externally, but it's different. It's a totally different motorcycle, really.
Yeah.
From the
You think just the stickers and a few details have changed, but
No,
it was a
from
total
the frame,
redesign.
from the frame out, even the frame is different. Yeah.
Well, Mick, it's been really kind of you to the original drawings that you did and you kept, you've donated here to the museum, and obviously we're very grateful to you and lucky to have them here. And I thought an interesting thing I wanted to ask you about was something you were working on towards the end of the development with the Commando.
Wasn't that the Norton 76?
This would have been a Mark
Did we
IV,
call it that?
Is that right?
Well, there was an odd period of time when some of the design department from Norton's were moved to a place called Kitts Green in Birmingham, and that's where we were joined by some Triumph guys that were also in the design era. And I was there for about a year and a half, and then we all moved to a place in the countryside called Shenstone, and by that time the Triumph part was not part of Norton. So it was, what we're looking at there is what we call the Mark IV, and it was to supersede the Mark III. And a lot of the parts that we were designing, like we were designing new forks and new brake calipers, and they would have been used on the Triumph it was the T160.
Yeah, I even see here there's a T160
yeah.
tail
yeah.
light. And
yeah. So that was being able to use, we thought at the time, new tooling for gas tanks, side panels, forks, calipers, and unfortunately it didn't come into fruition, but that was an exciting time because again it was a chance to design something from the ground up rather than do what little modifications you could do.
So this actually never, did it even go to prototype or
No,
just no?
It did not. We went to a styling prototype and
yeah.
there's some photos of some mock-ups with modeling clay, but that's as far as we got with it. I think with the brake caliper it went as far as a pre-production hand machined one. The forks, no, we never got far with those. By that time the company was really in a state of flux as to where to go next. They had three choices. There was the Cosworth Twin, which was a race engine that unfortunately didn't do very well. There was the Commando, which they decided really couldn't survive well. There was a 3-cylinder Triumph, which also was old engineering. And actually there were 4 choices, because then there was the rotary bike. When the rotary bike, this was the rotary era. Suzuki had a rotary, there were a lot of rotary cars. Hercules, a German make, had a rotary. Van Veen, a German machine, had a rotary. And BSA at the time were working on a rotary, and when we amalgamated it became a Triumph rotary, then a Norton rotary. So at the time there was a lot of choices to be made, and the final choice was rotary. But when we moved to Shenstone, everything was rotary, all rotary.
So this would be...
That was the end of the line for... We're talking about Commandos, and we're talking about how long the Commando has been around. And we're talking about 50 years afterwards. And we have Brian sitting here who, for more than half the time that Commando's been out, he's been working at Barber. Working here,
them,
restoring them,
making sure that the bikes we see
yeah,
are correct.
Yeah, and making sure that the visitor, who wouldn't know if it wasn't correct, gets to see the genuine article.
Yeah.
Because one of the problems with old motorcycles is that there's so many old wives' tales and half-truths told about this, that, and the other, that to actually restore it so as it left the factory is a tough job to do. And I really admire the fact that these, they're as close to factory as you can get, and it's a three-dimensional snapshot from 50 years ago.
Yeah, and I think Brian and I talk about this a lot. I mean, it's like, it's so important they are correct, because and I think you've talked about this, you've even read articles about things you're supposed to have done you didn't do.
Yeah, truth gets distorted with time, and it's not necessarily intentional. I don't think in most cases things are intentionally distorted. It's just because there's not much documentation sometimes, you're relying on what you remember. And Brian was around during Associated Motorcycles, AMC, and then into Norton, and that's a massive period of time that you've covered, so that you can look at something and through sheer memory and go, no, that ain't right. We never made them like that.
But it's fantastic, the body of work he and the people here at Barber have done over these last years to preserve these motorcycles.
It's really funny, the 2 Commandos here, the Roadster and the Interstate, they're brand new, out the crate, never been on the road, and we get this Norton enthusiast, and they come in here and say, well, that's not right, that should be silver painted, that's not right, that's chrome. And I don't say a word, I just listen to them. And I mean, you can't get anything better nothing's been restored on the motorcycle. I mean, they're brand new. It's like 50 years ago, you know, if you bought one, this is what it would be like.
But it's interesting how detail-oriented so-called enthusiasts are, because when the 850 first came out, my wife and I, we borrowed one to go to the Isle of Man on. It was an 850 Roadster, and the other thing we were messing around with was putting the caliper from behind the forkleg to in front of the forkleg, because when it was behind the forkleg, in wet conditions, the water would run around the forkleg into the caliper, so for a fraction of a second you had no braking at all, because it was all water. So we put it in front of the forkleg, and we were worried riding the bike over there that somebody had spotted the different cylinder barrels that the 850 had. Nobody noticed it, but everybody go, "Oh, you got the brake caliper on the wrong side." That's what everybody noticed. So that was a relief to us, because we thought, well, we don't want to appear a photograph in motorcycle news going, "Norton comes out with a brand new bike." But it's all the detail orientation that people have.
But in that era, things moved so much slower, didn't they? Development
very
couldn't
much
go.
so.
It's
Development
got. I
was
mean,
slow.
It took a year to get an improvement.
Yeah, and your development time was long because you didn't have any technology to speed up your development. But after that period, we went through a period, not necessarily with the British market, because the British market had died off by then, but certainly the Japanese market. They're in such a rush to come out with new models that massive mistakes were made, massive mistakes were made. And one of the jobs that a friend of mine had was working on a certain model of Yamaha, which was turned out to be a total disaster. And they finished up just sinking them in the North Sea. You know, whole boatloads of them. And because if you speed up your development too much, then all of a sudden you're telling the consumer, by the way, you're a development rider, let us know what goes wrong. So the long period of development is good to a point, but there's a fine balance. You know, and there's always been a fine balance. Nowadays it's quicker, but there's still a balance. You don't want to bring something out before it's fully proven.
Well, Mick and Brian, I think we should wrap up and leave this at a point where we've got more things to talk about, because then that's a great excuse to have you guys come back, if you will. And thank you. Yeah.
And you know, we've finished with like virtually the end of the Commando era, and at Norton's that was the beginning of another era that we can talk.
Which will be a great place, I think, for us to pick it up. So, you know, thank you everybody for watching. Mick Ofield for coming down from Tennessee, Brian, for the amazing contribution that both you gentlemen have made to our motorcycle world. And, you know, I think today this special privilege of being able to go back to Wolverhampton, England 50 years ago with the people who were there to understand why these bikes that we see here at the museum exist and how they were made. To me, it's an absolute honor and a privilege, and we thank you.